Now, on to land issues. We're joined by Katlego Ramantsima, who is a land reform researcher at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, which is otherwise known as PLAAS at the University of the Western Cape. She speaks to us as we reflect back on past statements made by the President of South Africa on the kind of changes to the law that will be made with regards to a special or should I say vulnerable groups in South Africa who are still yet to attain land. For instance, the HSRC, the Human Sciences Research Council, saying last year that women are still peripheral to South Africa's land debate, saying women own just 13% of private farmland in South Africa against a world average of 20%. Now, of course, this discussion also takes place against the backdrop of the governing party, the ANC, failing to achieve a two-thirds majority in the achievement of a two-thirds majority to amend Section 25 of the Constitution. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Katlego. Let's just first start with that. I mean, the ANC had tried to work with different parties, but it was clear that there were very divergent views, that even though they agreed on some issues with the EFF, for instance, they were diametrically opposed with the DA and the Freedom Front Plus. So apart from that, what is failing South African politicians for coalescing around this issue?
Thank you so much for having me. I think with regards to the amendment of Section 25 in December last year, I think there was a clear reasons by the other parties, like such as the EFF, as to why they don't want, they wouldn't support the ANC with by giving them votes to expropriate land. Other social civil society organizations have also been very open about not allowing this because of the Constitution already allows for expropriation of land to occur. However, the ANC has been very adamant in the January statement to say that even without the votes of those other parties, they will continue to ensure that expropriation is one of the tools that they will use to steer the issue of land reform forward. I think also it's the lack of political will from the ANC in steering this. So this year, I think we're all looking forward to hearing, more of the plans that they have in place to ensure that land reform is fostered in a democratic way.
Okay, so let's just look at one of the issues that came up, the issue of custodianship. What is the role of wholesale nationalization or custodianship of the state of land, protecting vulnerable groups? Does it feature at all in the security of tenure of land reform and distribution?
State custodianship and nationalization are two separate things. Nationalization simply means that the state basically owns and fully has control of all the resources. So with regards to state custodianship, this means that the state will have rights to administer some of its resources, in particularly land. But in their statement around custodianship, they also mentioned that they will administer certain lands, but it is yet not certain which lands they are referring to. So I guess also in the SONA, maybe the president will clarify for us, because all of us, all parties are still, unclear as to how is the state going to do the state custodianship should it happen. But it's not clearly it's not going to happen because they had already failed last year to get the votes.
So the ANC saying at the time, and as you mentioned, President Cyril Ramaphosa at some point saying that the party itself is not interested in this, but then having to amend or adjust its statement on this. But it did say that it recognizes as a party that state custodianship is necessary for particular purposes, redistribution and land reform. So in addition, that land held through traditional authority on behalf of communities, communal land, entrepreneurship or tenureship is another form of state custodianship which has been delegated to traditional authority to redistribute land. But we also know, if we look at the Ingonyama Trust, for instance, and the case that was brought to the courts in 2018, that there are some gaps in the legal framework. Why does this not feature high in the argument, particularly if the ANC says its failure to achieve a 2/3 majority on the amendment of Section 25, that is just a journey that is still continuing? But why is this still not high on the agenda?
Well, it would be very difficult for me as a researcher to say why, because I think these are questions. The question that you're asking is very pertinent, and the ANC should be responsible for assisting us in understanding why is it that they're going to continue with state custodianship. I mean, state custodianship has proven not to work in the communal lands. Traditional leaders, authorities rather, do not own the land, but are merely administering land. The state is basically the custodian to the state. So I don't have a very clear answer as to that or what should happen.
Okay. Well, before we go back to the broader argument or the subject matter which we've invited you in terms of policy changes with regards to women, youth and people with disabilities, I'd like to stay with this just in terms of communal land and use the issue of the Ingonyama Trust Act of 1994 as an example. It has come under scrutiny, and I'm wondering, the Legal Resources Centre application to the Pietermaritzburg High Court, was it significant in terms of bringing about much needed change in terms of how we view communal land or traditional land? This was done, of course, on behalf of the Council of Advancement of the Constitution and Rural Women's Movements and several other informal rights holders. But there were some gains made there. It strikes me as odd that the state that makes it its business, a government rather, makes it its business to make these legislative changes, is itself then told by the courts, the state, another arm of the state, that it must make these changes.
As the state, yes, courts are responsible, obviously, for leading these processes, and the state must adhere to, what the courts and the people suggest. So I think that is the reason why the state ends up taking what the courts actually suggest. So this is the reason why we see these issues not being resolved, because courts have often been very slow in resolving these cases. People have not been represented the way that they should be, and the state ends up taking the sides of those who have much more dominant voices in those court processes.
The reason, again, I'm going to the state commitments of the state here. I'm talking about government to change the laws. The court application itself was to challenge the conversion of the permissions to occupy or informal land rights to long-term leases by the trust. In terms of the Act, which I believe that it continues to see unlawful practices because of this, insofar as gender discrimination is concerned. So if there are clear violations of the constitutions because of the current law, there's a panel that the president had appointed which released a report in 1999 which had already released some of its findings, including its recommendations. Why is the state slow to make some of these changes?
Like I said in the beginning, I think the state is very slow in making these decisions because, one, they lack the political will to do that. Secondly, I think the state, even though these decisions are taken in court, they don't have like the correct or right mechanisms to proceed with these changes and so forth. And besides, policy also is never an overnight thing. It usually takes a long time for it to be implemented correctly.
Okay. All right, so let's go back to what government had said, for instance, that it would change the laws to focus on women, youth, and people with disabilities. And I'm just thinking, in terms of its approach conceptually of land tenure and reform in South Africa, how important is infusing into the legal framework the African context of land ownership, even on issues of land resolution, prioritizing vulnerable groups?
I think it's very important because currently in South Africa, land ownership patterns are still pertinent and critical. I mean, much of the land is owned privately. And the state only owns like 14% of that land, which just gives you a clear indication that even when it gets to issues around, gender and other marginalized groups, we're still going to face the same challenge. And it is important that they do infuse, make clear statements to say an X amount of women will be prioritized, and not only make statements, but to also act and making sure that those groups get prioritized and actually get to own the land. So it also suggests that, there's a serious need for, equitable access to land for social justice. So I think, we do need the state to have the correct willpower to ensure that those groups and other poor people, both in the rural and urban context, to access land.
All right, Katlego Ramantsima, thank you so much for speaking to us. She's a land reform researcher at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, PLAAS at the University of the Western Cape. I do apologize for the abrupt manner in which we are ending this interview, just as we're getting the building blocks in place to have a more in-depth conversation. But there is some news that's just come in. Parliament's Standing Committee on Intelligence here in South Africa has started to interview 10 candidates who have been shortlisted for the position of the Inspector General of Intelligence. The current Inspector General of Intelligence, Setlo Mamaru Dintwe's contract comes to an end next month. Dintwe and the Reverend Frank Chikane and other 8 candidates have been shortlisted for the position. The Inspector General of Intelligence monitors and reviews the operations of the intelligence services, of which they include the State Security Agency, the Defence Intelligence and the Crime Intelligence of the Police. Last week, President Cyril Ramaphosa published the report into last year's unrest in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, which made damning findings against the role of the security forces and the intelligence services in preventing the unrest. Reverend Chikane is being interviewed at the moment. Let's listen in and watch.